hemodynamic physiology, and the second will be presented by Dr. Suhath Bait about cardiac physiology. So we shall start in about 5 minutes. Firas, you can prepare your slides if you don't mind.
الو الو
أهلا.
صوتي واضح؟
واضح.
معليش بس بجرب سماعات جديدة out of the blue يعني.
ما في مشكلة.
السلام عليكم جميعا. Sorry for interruption.
دكتور فراس.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام. تفضل.
طيب. So today, as Dr. Lai mentioned, we will discuss the physiology of cardiovascular system, and it will be divided by two parts. The first will be hemodynamics and will be discussed by myself. So Firas Fatani, R1 from King Abdulaziz University Hospital, Jeddah. So the goal of this lecture is to define cardiac output and to define volume pressure loop. The goal of the heart is to achieve organ perfusion. Organ perfusion is determined by arterial deriving pressure modulated by vascular bed resistance. It can be understood by the application of the classical Ohm's law, law used in physics to measure the electrical circuit. This law mentions that the voltage potential difference across the circuit equals to the current flow multiplied by the circuit resistance. This same law or equation can be somehow applied in cardiovascular system to measure cardiac output. So circuit output is a function of deriving voltage divided by circuit resistance. Cardiac output, the same as circuit output, equals deriving voltage, which is blood pressure in our case, divided by circuit resistance, in our case, the systemic vascular resistance. Blood pressure also equals cardiac output multiplied by vascular resistance. The systemic vascular resistance is affected by different components, mainly directly proportionate to the length of the vessel and the viscosity of the blood, and inversely proportionate to the radius of the vessel. Cardiac output equals heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So cardiac output is volume of blood over a period of time. So stroke volume, volume of blood pumped from left ventricle per beat, ejection fraction, stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. Those are mainly equations to measure and determine the function of the cardiovascular system. So as said, the function of the cardiac system is to achieve perfusion, and any disturbance in the hemodynamic may manifest as cardinal cardiovascular symptom, such as dyspnea reflecting pulmonary venous congestion, fatigue attributable to inadequate cardiac output, syncope resulting from transient profound hypotension. Also peripheral edema related to systemic venous congestion. So those symptoms are not specific for a disturbance in a function, and also not specific to cardiovascular system. Hemodynamic can be divided, function of hemodynamic can be divided to systolic function and diastolic performance. The systolic function is the ability of the heart to pump, generate pressure, and perfuse the body. Diastolic performance, the ability of the chambers to fill at physiological pressure with the preload necessary to generate stroke volume. As mentioned, systolic function reflects the ability of the ventricle to contract and generate output or stroke work, and it is determined by the loading condition, preload, afterload, and contractile state. Preload is determined by the venous return and end diastolic volume. The afterload is determined by aortic impedance and wall stress. The preload is defined as the initial stretching of the cardiovascular myocytes prior to contraction, and it is related to ventricular filling. The afterload is defined by the force or load against which the heart has to contract to eject the blood. Contractility is the intrinsic strength of cardiac muscle independent of preload, but a change in preload will affect the force of contractility. Also, there is systemic vascular resistance discussed in the which affect the cardiac output inversely. It is the resistance to blood flow offered by the systemic vasculature. There is a law called Frank-Starling law, stated by the scientist Frank. The heart will pump what it receives. In other words, when the stretch of myocyte occur during loading of the heart, the affinity of the myocyte to troponin C increase, and the affinity of troponin C increase to calcium ions, increasing the contractile force. Here are two diagrams showing the relationship. In fact, the first showing the relationship in Frank-Starling law. So in Frank-Starling, as Frank-Starling mentioned, when the end-diastolic volume increases, the stroke volume increase, thus the cardiac output increase. When the contractility increase by ionotrope, this curve will be steeper, increasing the cardiac output much more when the volume is increased, and will be shallower or flatter if the ionotrope, if there is negative ionotropy. Thus, the cardiac output will increase less by when the end-diastolic volume increase. The other diagram shows the effect of afterload on the cardiac output. In normal condition, afterload, when the afterload increases, the cardiac output will decrease. And this curve is somehow less flatter than if there is a abnormal condition in the heart, in congestive heart failure. So in congestive heart failure, if afterload increase, the resistance increase, the stroke volume will decrease more. So there is a steep or more depressed cardiac output if afterload increase. So the control of cardiac output, usually heart generates its own electrical impulse, but there is some modulation occur by the nervous system in response to environmental changes to change the heart rate and change the cardiac output. Cardiovascular center is located in medulla oblongata. It has two centers, accelerator center and inhibitory center. Acceleratory center mainly sympathetic nerves, and decelerator are parasympathetic nerve carried by vagus nerve. So the autonomic neuronal influence allow us to modify cardiac pumping as it's appropriate to meet changing hemostatic needs of the body. Sympathetic nerve fiber at the neural ending release norepinephrine, which interact with beta-1 adrenergic receptor in cardiac myocyte, increasing the heart rate, action potential conduction velocity. Overall increase in cardiac pumping or cardiac output. Parasympathetic nerves carried by vagus nerve mainly function by releasing acetylcholine on cardiac muscle, which interact with muscarinic receptor, decreasing heart rate and action potential conduction velocity. Parasympathetic nerves may also act to decrease the force of contraction of atria. Overall, parasympathetic action act to decrease cardiac pumping. Usually, an increase in parasympathetic nerve activity is accompanied by decrease in sympathetic, and vice versa. An increase in sympathetic will decrease in the parasympathetic nerve activity. Moving to vasculature, blood that is ejected into the aorta by the left heart passes consecutively through many different types of vessels before it returns to the right heart. So starting from the aorta to the arteries, then arterioles, then capillaries, venules, and veins. Each one of those has its own difference. Have difference. There is difference among them. Like the aorta, its internal diameter is 2.5, wall thickness 2 millimeter, total cross-sectional area 4.5, and so on. So there is also something called total cross-sectional area. So the total cross-sectional area of every vasculature in the same parallel plane. So here in this plane, there is only aorta, and the total cross-section is 4.5. When we go to the bifurcation, there is more, it bifurcates to arteries. In the same plane, the cross-section, total cross-sectional area will increase to 20, reaching to 4,500 centimeters square, up to 4,500 in the capillaries. Arteries are often referred to as conduit vessel because they have relatively low and unchanging resistance to flow. Arterioles, smaller and structured differently than arteries. They have much thicker wall with more smooth muscle and less elastic material. The diameter of arterioles can be changed by autonomic regulation, and thus regulate the blood flow. Capillaries are the smallest vessel in the vasculature. The capillary wall consists of a single layer of endothelial cells that separates the blood from the interstitial fluid by only approximately 1 micrometer. Capillaries contain no smooth muscle and thus lack the ability to change their diameter actively. Venous vessels have very thin walls in proportion to their diameter. Their walls contain smooth muscle. The diameter can actively change because of their thin walls. Venous vessels are quite distensible. In essence, the bulk of vascular system is simply to route blood flow from the heart and back to it. Blood, a complex fluid that serves as the medium for transporting substances between the tissues of the body and performs a host of other functions. So 40% of the blood volume is blood cells, red blood cells. The other 60% is plasma. The fraction of blood volume occupied by cells is termed as hematocrit. So the cell volume divided by total volume is hematocrit. The blood viscosity increased dramatically with an increase in the hematocrit. The higher the blood viscosity, the more work the heart has to do to produce any given flow through the vasculature. Also, blood viscosity causes energy loss by heat via fluid friction as it flows through any vessel, So the types of cells in the blood are red blood cell, the most abundant, and carry oxygen from the lung to the tissue. blood can transport 40 times to 50 times the amount of oxygen due to the presence of hemoglobin. White cells involved in the immune response and platelet in blood clotting process. Moving to the final objective or goal, the pressure volume loop. So the pressure volume loop is a loop that plot the changes of loading condition of the heart, preload, contractility, and afterload. So it starts from as systole start by mitral valve closure. There will be something called isovolumic contraction. The volume of the heart will be constant, but the pressure will increase until it exceeds the aortic pressure. When this happens, the aortic valve opens and we will move to the ejection phase. During the ejection phase, the volume will decrease, the ventricle will repolarize, and the left ventricle ejection will cease, and relaxation will begin after. So at the end of when the ventricle start to repolarize, the pressure will decrease under the pressure in left ventricle will decrease under the pressure in the aortic valve, and here aortic valve closes. This point is also called end systolic pressure volume point, and will be discussed in the next slide. It has its own importance. So after aortic valve closure, there will be isovolumic relaxation until the atrial pressure will be, or the left ventricular pressure will be less than the atrial pressure. Here will mitral valve will open. Also, the width of the pressure volume loop this equals to the stroke volume, the difference between end systolic and end diastolic volumes. There is something called Emax, or maximal elastance, and it is defined as the maximal slope of the end systolic pressure volume points under various loading conditions, and the line of these points is the end systolic pressure volume relationship. So in the end systolic pressure volume here, if we manipulate the preload status of the heart simply by decreasing the inferior vena cava or clamping the inferior vena cava, the volume of the heart will decrease, and the stroke volume will decrease also, and the pressure will decrease. The end diastolic pressure volume will decrease. So if we plot a line between those two end systolic pressure volume relation, we will come up with this slope, which represents the maximum elastance. So effective arterial elastance, another term, measures left ventricular afterload and is defined as the ratio of end systolic pressure to stroke volume. Here are some other figures of pressure volume loop. The first being left ventricular and aortic pressure as measured by during cardiac catheterization, here being the mitral valve closure, volumic contraction, open of the aortic valve, ejection, closure of aortic valve, and then isovolumic relaxation. Here is the same diagram discussed before. And here, this diagram shows the effect of afterload in the cardiac output. So as the afterload increases, the systolic volume, the stroke volume, sorry, will, as the afterload increases, the stroke volume will decrease and the aortic pressure will increase. Also, the end diastolic pressure volume will increase. And this diagram can be is the same here happens in the aortic stenosis, where afterload increase due to the stenotic aortic valve. So the end diastolic volume pressure volume increase, stroke volume decrease also, and in the last figure, the effect of ionotropic drugs on the pressure volume loop. So ionotropic drug shift the end diastolic pressure volume relation upward. So this is the end diastolic pressure relation, also Emax. So it will be shifted upward. And it's also, the ionotropic drug also will increase stroke volume. So now I guess I've finished my presentation. Those are my references. And feel free to ask any question. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Firas. So anyone has a comment or question for Dr. Firas? Okay, so we'll continue to the second lecture. Just have 10 minutes break and then we'll come back.
Okay.
دكتورة سهى.
Yes, Doctor.
تفضل.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. I would like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Suat Bait, R1 resident at King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center, Riyadh City. During my talk this afternoon, I will provide you with some background on cardiac physiology. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm happy to answer your questions as we go along. Today, I will be covering these 4 key points. I will provide you with some background on cardiac muscle histology. Then we will talk about myocardial action potential. The next thing that I will share with you is cardiac cycle. And finally, we will discuss the different mechanisms for regulation of blood pressure. As we're gonna talk about action potential, we need to review some of the microscopic anatomy of the cardiomyocyte. First, we have sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane. And inside the cell, there are many myofibrils. Myofibrils are bundles of filaments or bundles or filaments, particularly actin and myosin. The myofibrils are surrounded by sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is comparable to endoplasmic reticulum in other cell types, and it's really notable for storage of calcium. These structures are called T-tubules. T-tubules are basically like channels that sort throughout the myocardial cells. That is very much rich in mitochondria compared to skeletal cells and have centrally located nucleus. The cardiac cell is joined end to end by specialized structure called intercalated disc. Moving to the next main point, which is myocardial action potential. Cardiac cells can be divided into autorhythmic pacemaker cells that are primarily concentrated in SA node and AV node, and contractile cells. When SA node spontaneously depolarize, it will generate action potential that has to be spread throughout the cells. And if we zoom in on intercalated disc, it consists of these 2 types of junctions. Desmosome that helps stretching, and gap junction that help to pass the action potential from one cardiac cell to the next. Now, if you take a cell in the body, any cell, what you're gonna find is that different charge from inside that cell compared to outside. Let's take one cardiomyocyte. It's a little bit negative inside compared to outside because of this pump sitting in its membrane that brings 3 sodium from inside and pumps it outside. In the exact time, it takes 2 potassium from outside the cell and pumps it in. You will have a net positive charge outside the cell compared to inside. You may ask, what's the difference? Well, in cardiac muscle, it's -90, and this is the resting membrane potential. Now we have established the gradient of sodium outside and potassium in. The diffusion, it will not stay in diffusion. So this high outside concentration of sodium tends to diffuse toward where is there is low sodium concentration, which is inside the cell. And for the potassium, we have generated high potassium concentration inside, and it tends to move towards the outside low potassium concentration. For this, we have a specific sodium channel and a specific potassium channel. At rest, these sodium channels are closed. So the sodium is trapped out. Potassium channel also at rest are closed, but some remain a little bit open and allowing potassium to leaking out of the cell, bringing its positive charge and making even more negative inside the cell. Now, if we stimulate this cell, the stimulus will open up these sodium channels, and a little bit of sodium starts to trickle into the cell. Now, was this important? If we would like to have a graph, you remember that we said this cell at rest have resting membrane potential of negative 90. But because of the sodium or positive sodium starts to get in, it moves towards the positive side. And once it hits negative 70, which is the threshold, the rest of sodium channels open up and the sodium rushes inside the cell. Figure about what that means. If all this sodium rushes inside the cell, the curve will shut up, making inside the cell more positive, which was originally negative, and this is the depolarization. Now you know that the cardiac cells are connected to each other through gap junction. So some of the sodium can trickle into the next cell, and the same happens, the next cell starts to depolarize. Once the depolarization has occurred and reaches around positive 20, here the potassium starts to leak out. As the potassium leaks out, another channel, this is the last channel you have to be aware of, which is calcium channel, starts to open up and calcium starts to get into the cell. Now we have positive stuff leaving the cell and positive stuff coming inside the cell. They balance each other and will result in plateau phase. These calcium channels will close soon, but the potassium channels remain open and the potassium to leak out of the cell, bringing the negative charge again into side and will develop into repolarization. As this curve jump down and we will have repolarization. This slide just summarizes what we have said and making everything together. We can say that the myocardial action potential can be divided into 5 phases, starting at 4, which is resting membrane potential, then depolarization, which is caused by sodium influx. Then we have phase 1, when the sodium channels close and the potassium leaking out, calcium starts to get in, giving the plateau phase, and the repolarization, which is caused by the potassium efflux. Anyone can please answer this question? What's the significance of the plateau phase that we have described before? If we can just make the presentation more active.
It prolongs the systolic phase to give the heart time for emptying.
Okay, so how's that? The calcium L-type calcium channels located in the T-tubule penetrating the cell, it close to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Therefore, when the calcium enters through them, it binds to ryanodine receptors on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, stimulate excessive calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This phenomenon is called the calcium-induced calcium release, is essential for the excitation, contraction, coupling of the myocardial cell. When the calcium binds to the troponin C and allowing the sliding of actin and myosin permitting contraction. In contrast, there is extremely difference between the action potential of cardiac cells and those of conducting cells. This figure illustrates action potential of a cell from SA node. Note that the resting, it does not have a steady resting potential. Instead, it undergoes slow depolarization. This gradual depolarization is known as pacemaker potential. These cells consist of funny sodium channels that's very leaky. So a little bit of sodium gets into the cell very slowly and moves the resting membrane potential, which is at -60, slowly towards around -55. At this point, T-type calcium channel open up and a little bit of calcium starts to get into the cell. These channels will bring the membrane potential to the threshold. Once it hits -40, another type of calcium channels called L-type will open up very quickly and the curve rises up, so a lot of calcium starts to get into the cell. Now it's very or super positive inside the cell. This is the depolarized phase of this action potential, and it reaches about +20. At this point, this calcium channel shuts off, and with it, when it shuts off, potassium channel open and start to leak out of the cell, bringing the cell back to the resting potential because of the coming back of the negativity inside the cell. So the pacemaker potential, it's unstable, but generally it's at -60. And because of the slow leakage of potassium and faster leakage of the sodium, this is the slow depolarization or pacemaker depolarization that's very classical for pacemaker cells. And the calcium channels opening and approach the threshold. The other type of calcium channel, which is L-type, will open at the threshold and more rapid depolarization. Then it's just closed and the slow potassium channels open and the membrane depolarizes, cause a flux of potassium and repolarization of membrane. The orderly process we have discussed about depolarization triggers reoccurring cardiac cycle of atrial and ventricular contraction. I will present an overview of the cardiac cycle, naming different phases. We will discuss the atrial versus ventricular pressure, arterial versus ventricular pressure, what is happening to AV valves, and what is happening to pulmonary and aortic valves. Now, this figure represents the different pressure of aortic, atrial, and ventricular pressure. The first event defined as mid to late ventricular diastole. When is this happening? When the blood returning back to the atria, whenever the blood starts accumulating into the atria, it starts to open up the AV valves. As the atrial pressure exceeds the ventricular pressure. Basically, 70 to 80% of the blood fall down into the ventricles. But soon, the SA node start firing, depolarizing the atria and causing atrial systole. that push the remaining 20% of blood into the ventricle. And this is the period of ventricular filling. The blood accumulating at the end of this phase, at the end of diastole, is called end diastolic volume. The ventricle starts to depolarize, so the ventricular pressure rises and overcomes the atrial pressure. Note that before, the aortic valve is closed because the aortic pressure is much higher than the ventricular pressure. And throughout the diastole, the aortic pressure is slowly flow. Coming to this stage or starting of ventricular systole, whenever this ventricular pressure overcomes the atrial pressure, it closes the AV valves. And for a brief of time, all the valves are closed during this phase of isovolumetric ventricular contraction phase. Then the ventricle starts to contract and the pressure or ventricular pressure exceeds the aortic pressure, forces the aortic valve to open. As the blood flow into the aorta, the aortic pressure rises along with the ventricular pressure. When the ejection ends, the ventricle starts to relax, so the ventricular pressure falls below aortic pressure, and again we will have the stage of that the valves are all closed in isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. Quickly, we'll revise what we have said. At rest, both atria and ventricles are in diastole, and the filling due to low pressure conditions. In atrial systole, complete ventricular filling, isovolumetric ventricular contraction, the increased pressure in ventricles causes the AV valves to close, and this will create the first heart sound. Of course, the atria go back to diastole, and no blood flow as aortic valve is closed as well. The fourth phase is ventricular ejection. The intraventricular pressure will overcome aortic pressure and the blood is ejected. And for the last, which is the isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, the intraventricular pressure drops below aortic pressure. So the closes of semilunar valve will produce the second heart sound. Coming to the last idea that I will talk about in my presentation, which is the regulation of blood pressure. Let's have an overview of factors contributing to blood pressure. There are main four mechanisms controlling the normal arterial blood pressure. Autonomic nervous system. This is the most rapid response mechanism, and it's short-term regulation. There is continuous information received in the brainstem vasomotor center from the central baroreceptors located in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. For example, if there is decreased blood pressure, it will stimulate the sympathetic nervous system that will act on beta adrenergic receptor, increased cardiac contractility, and through alpha receptor, it will cause peripheral arterial and venous vasoconstriction. Capillary fluid shift. The equilibrium of a fluid exchange across the capillary wall between the blood and the interstitial fluid is determined by hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure that exists across the capillary wall. So low blood pressure results in fluid moving from the interstitial space to the circulation, helping to restore the blood volume and the blood pressure. There are two main hormonal systems which act on different targets, يعني both resulting in rapid response to change in arterial blood pressure. The first is that by the adrenal gland, which secretes endogenous catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, in response to sympathetic activation and increased cardiac output through increased heart rate and contractility via beta-adrenergic receptors. We have renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Whenever the kidney has reduced blood flow, it secretes renin that is essential for cleavage of angiotensinogen, which is produced by the liver into angiotensin 1. And it's activated in the lungs by AC enzyme and converted into angiotensin 2 that stimulates the adrenal cortex and results in aldosterone secretion. This is a potent vasoconstriction that acts to decrease glomerular permeability and urinary fluid and electrolyte loss. The last regulation mechanism is renal regulation of fluid and electrolyte balance, and this is the most important mechanism for long-term control of blood pressure. Whenever we have decreased extracellular fluid, the sodium chloride concentration leads to inhibition of antidiuretic hormone secretion and produce or result in diuresis. While we have increased sodium chloride promotes production of concentrated urine and water reabsorption by increasing the antidiuretic hormone. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Any question?
We'll prepare presentation, Shada. Soha, sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Asa. Your effort in this presentation is obvious, and I like how you explained the action potential. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Suhan. Any questions or comment?